The following is a short clip on Levinas's view of the other with Dr. Aaron Simmons. This is a clip from our longer interview on Levinas, so if you do want to check out the full video after watching this one, then go check it out. I'll put a card to it up above. I hope you enjoy this video, and let's get into the interview. What is Levinas's view of the other?
And I will say there's some debate on this. So I'll give you what I consider the standard view. Standard view goes something like this: the other, l'autrui in French, is different than simply l'autre. And the difference is there are all kinds of things that are other than me. So the cup out of which I am drinking is other than me, right? The cell phone upon which I make calls is other than me. So alterity can just be a kind of phenomenology of objects, the difference between self and other objects. And in many ways, this is what we find in Heidegger. So in Heidegger, he'll make the distinction between, objects that are ready to hand, present at hand, the way that they show up as equipment. And then he says about Dasein, they are part of the fabric of my world. They are other objects, but they're distinctive objects. They are objects who have the same mode of being that I find in myself. So other Dasein emerge as a particular kind of object insofar as I'm able to recognize this shared mode of existence. We see something similar in Martin Buber, who differentiates between other objects that are it beings and objects that are thou beings, which again is this distinction: other beings like me versus other beings unlike the kind of being that I and other beings like me have. Well, for Levinas, when he's talking about the other in this moral sense, it is not simply a theory of objects. It's not just other stuff that is not me. He's talking about what is it that would invite the moral response that I call my selfhood. So here he's drawing on, he says this explicitly, a Hebraic idea, this Jewish idea of God basically calling out, where are you? And the response is, Hinei, here I am. So notice in this Hebraic account of God calling out, and we see this in two different places, of course, with Adam, walking through the garden, Adam, where are you? Hinei, here I am. And then with Abraham on top of the mountain during the Akedah, Abraham, where are you? Here I am. In both of these moments, the here I am is a response to that which calls. So one of the basic ways his view of the other as other person, l'autrui, is that which calls forth my selfhood as response. Now, that idea, of course, gets us a pretty long way down an interesting moral road. The question becomes, well, how far does that extend? And this is where Levinas introduces, again, a Hebraic Jewish idea of the neighbor, which then also, of course, is appropriated in lots of Christian ethics. Of course, Soren Kierkegaard makes a lot of neighbor love as the height of Christian moral life. When Levinas talks about loving the neighbor as oneself, as a kind of moral imperative, he says, well, who is my neighbor? That question is an attempt to delimit or circumscribe the sphere of my moral obligation. And isn't this kind of how we all live, right? We all say, how can I make sure that I'm doing only what I'm required to do? And then if I do more, I want extra praise for it. Levinas is trying to actually say the neighbor, and he defines it this way, as the one who is near and far off. In other words, there is no mode in which we get to delimit who counts as a neighbor among the other people. They are all my neighbor. It's not just those who, again, think this kind of Husserlian or Heideggerian like me language. It's not those who are like me because our kids play baseball together. Those who like me share an ethnic background. Those who like me have a particular sort of racial identity. Those who like me are the right kinds of social class. all of those historical markers by which we would make sense of our historical existence and groupings of people, Levinas absolutely wrecks. He does this even to the point where he gets a lot of heat. So, he will basically be asked about, well, is there a limit of my responsibility? And Levinas's response is simply no. And so somebody says, well, what about, your obligation to the SS officer? Surely you, as Jew suffering at their hands, don't have the same obligation. And his answer is really interesting. He says, because of my historical location, in other words, the experiences he's undergone, he said, I'm not the right person to ask. Right? But notice here he's splitting himself in this really cool way between Levinas, the philosopher, who has already said over and over and over, there is no limit. Right? The SS officer is not the SS officer, first and foremost, ethically. They are simply the other. There is no way to differentiate between the right others and the wrong others. But then Levinas, as a lived historical person, is saying, but that doesn't mean that I then can't politically, according to justice, make decisions about how to adjudicate between who gets my time, my energy, and my efforts, right? And so given the injustice in the world, the SS officer, maybe he was not at the top of that list. Do you see the way he's trying to pull this apart, right?
Yeah.
Maybe to make this more relevant for us, you might say, well, what about the white supremacist? Are they the other? Well, the Levinasian philosophy is not going to say a white supremacist is the other. They're going to say the other can in history become distorted and misguided by an evil philosophical view that would reject all non-white others. So the other has gotten distorted in their historical practice, but it doesn't occlude them from being the other. Now, me, Aaron Simmons, in the world, is the white supremacist my other? Well, the problem with this, of course, is, well, as a person who cares about racial justice, it's like, I'm way more concerned about the victims of white supremacy than I am about those perpetuating it, right? And yet, the only way that I can try to make sense of this as a vision of some sort of social reconciliation by which real charity is possible is to recognize, as he puts it, there is always charity after justice, right? Sometimes we have to stand up to those others who are violent and threatening to other others and stop them. But the goal is then to interrogate my own exclusion of that other and recognize, shoot, yeah, we have to stop that injustice. But in doing so, I'm also obligated to continue to see that person as other. And an example of how we do this is, think about like court systems in democracies. We have actually a really interesting idea. We say, oh, you're guilty of some horrible, horrible crime. We're going to punish you, right? We're going to lock you up. We're going to remove you from certain freedoms, whatever it might be. And we still recognize them, though, as the other person by saying, and we may have gotten it wrong. The appeal system remains. We will continue to try to see your face if we have messed up, if we have not, in fact, done this appropriately. So Levinas is pretty slick, I think pretty wise at how he kind of gives us this absolutely all-inclusive account of who the other person is and the historical tools for realizing how hard this is then going to be to live out. Now, I'll say three things about pressure points, though, on this point. One, what about non-human others? That's a big issue. And there are Levinasians who suggest Levinas himself was not concerned about this, but his philosophy, actually, the other person is not limited to Homo sapiens, right? It's not limited to, other beings like us. Because again, we can't do that beings like us move. So therefore, the other is all sentient beings, right? Some go even further and say, no. Why are we then saying sentience? That looks an awful lot like some sort of rational capacity. Levinas rejects that. So even ecosystems and climate, and we've got this radical obligation to care for that which is the context in which we find ourselves. So we get called by the mountains, right? John Muir famously, the mountains are calling, I must go. well, maybe that call is a kind of ethical obligation. So non-human others is a real pressure point that lots of contemporary philosophers are trying to move through. I hold my own views on this and have written quite a bit about it, but they're irrelevant right this second. The other pressure point would be, is it the case, though, that Levinas doesn't allow for enough self-concern? So this is a critique that he gets from feminists in particular, but also you could motivate this critique from within race theory, queer theory, etc., which basically says, look, Levinas really hits the nail hard on the head, saying, I do not answer for the other's obligation to me. That is of no concern. My only concern is my obligation to the other. And at one point, he even gets asked, or he even says that I am responsible without end. I am responsible more than all the others. And here he's quoting Dostoevsky. We talked about his influences. Yeah. Dostoevsky has this line where he says, we are all guilty before all, but I more than all the others. Right? Now you can see that makes lots of sense as this phenomenological account of the quasi-logical conditions of moral life. That makes no sense as a battered spouse. That makes no sense as a victim of sexual assault. That makes no sense as a victim of racial marginalization and historical injustice. Wait a minute, right? Like, no, what about me? What about my status? What about the fact that I've been excluded and oppressed and marginalized? It seems like that's part of our ethical imperative. Levinas goes as far as to say we are responsible for the persecutions we undergo. That does not sit well with lots of contemporaries. It's if I remember, I think it was Ricoeur who even responds and says that this is a scandal. So it's really problematic when you cannot frame limits on who counts as the neighbor, because then you end up having to bite some big bullets that are really problematic about thinking, well, no, that neighbor can go screw themselves. I'm the one who should count. I'm the victim of this engagement. Levinas, again, creates an issue there, but his answer to it, whether it's a good one or not, I'll leave to others to decide. Again, I've given my answers to these things in lots of books, but he says it's in the political realm where we now get to count as an other for the others. As soon as we move away from that moral impetus that constitutes us as infinitely guilty, then we can move into the political realm where we have to start using judgment about distribution. We have to start using judgment about not everybody can count equally relative to limited resources, limited time, and limited access. So that's where he then, I think, is going to articulate, no, I can account for self-concern, for historical injustice, but it's going to be a political issue, not a moral one. But you can see why people would have issue with his kind of displacing that, right? Especially in a time of identity politics that wants to run those historical injustices all the way down. He's saying, no, they are secondary to who I am, constituted by the infinite obligation of every other.
If you've been enjoying this video so far and have found it helpful, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel financially and support our mission, then check out our Patreon in the link below, where you can support our channel there as well. Hope you enjoyed this video, and let's carry on.
And the third pressure point is, it seems like that this account is either, I think there's two sides of the same coin, radically utopian, right? That, man, it seems really hard to see how we're going to pull this off. We're going to somehow live this out. There's too many narcissists. There's too many egoists. There's too many selfies running around, right? Like we are a culture defined by self-interest. Get yours, get your money. Don't worry about the other person. Run them over if you need to. The habits of highly influential people is kind of ethical only insofar as it's still serving your interests to be successful, influential. Levinas is the guy saying, I don't have the power to be powerful. I am essentially, the words he used is hostage to the other. He says that we are hemorrhaging, because think about it, like you've got, you're bleeding and you can't close the wound. He says that's like the ethical encounter. There is no way to shore yourself up from the trauma that constitutes you as never self-sufficient. So it seems like this is utopian in a way that we'd say, well, you know what? Screw it. Let's just go be good consequentialists. Let's just go be good, virtue ethicists. I can do something with that. Levinas seems to eliminate our ability to do work. But the mirror image of that utopianism is what I would describe as a kind of quietism. Look, if I'm infinitely obligated to each and every other, no matter what I do, I've not done enough, right? I mean, you see the worry, right? The example I sometimes use here is, imagine you're a Red Cross helicopter pilot going into a flooded area that has been destroyed by a tsunami or whatever, and you hurricane or something, and people are on their roofs, and you go in to save people, right? Let's say that your carrying capacity of the helicopter is only 10 adults. So do you save 10 adults? Do you save 20 children? Do you save 5 adults and 10 children? Like, notice, maybe you even stretch it and you get 11 adults on, even though you know that now it's going to be a push to get back with the gas that you've got. Like, but here's the thing. However you do that, whatever choice you make, you're risking your life to go save the other, to give your last ounce of energy to help them. And necessarily you didn't save everybody. Right? Now, if there's only 8 adults on top of roofs, now you can pull it off. That's not the world we live in, right?
Yeah.
So you save the 10, you stretch to 11. Maybe you've got just a real skinny dude in there at 12, but you left 300 or even 1 behind. You are infinitely guilty. No matter what you've done, you didn't do enough, because remember, there is no limit to who counts as the other. That one is just as much other, just as much morally obligated as the ones I saved. So the worry is a kind of quietism. If I can't do enough, why even bother? Let's go get drunk. Let's go have some fun. Again, let's go get mine. I'm going to drive a Porsche. Screw it. Because if I sacrifice and work and struggle and do all for the other, I'm still infinitely guilty of not having done enough for the other. So these are the 3 worries: non-human others, the marginalized or victimized other, and then how do I reconcile the tension between the worries of utopianism and quietism? Ultimately, these, I think, are the real pressure points that have dominated the Levinasian scholarship for probably the last 20, 25 years.